Okay. Ms. Fisher, thank you so much for meeting with me this afternoon and for letting me come into your classroom to observe a guided reading lesson last Friday. I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me today. So I just want to give you kind of an overview of what the conference will look like today. I'm going to have you talk quite a bit. I just want to hear your reflections, so I'll ask you quite a few questions and just have you reflect on the lesson. Then I'll share some strong practices with you, and I'm going to connect them to the Iowa teaching standards versus the Nebraska ones. And then we'll discuss some possible improvements or next steps, okay? Let me grab a pencil real quick. My apologies. Okay. So I'm going to start by asking first, your learning goal was around story elements, problem solution, character setting. How did you select the learning goal for this guided reading lesson?
Well, we're in like fiction books right now, and that's a skill that we're reviewing with like our main story. So I was picking books that would fit that skill so they could get some like more practice in like a longer text.
So the story element skill is within your Storytown right now as well.
Within our standards for the week.
Okay, got it. Okay. And how long have these two groups in particular been working on story elements in guided reading?
Well, every week we kind of I try to pick like a different skill. So that's something that has been reviewed throughout the year, but not necessarily like back to back to back.
Okay.
So, I mean, they've gotten it probably once a month at least for the school year.
So it's not a skill that you're using until they master it. It's a skill that you're kind of bringing back around to keep it fresh in their minds?
Yeah.
Got it. So let's look at your artifacts. You brought some story maps with you today that your students did. So looking at these and then thinking about your observations during the guided reading lesson, what can you tell me about your students' ability to define or to identify story elements in a story?
Like my high group, they are the ones that like have plot events filled out. So they can pick events out, but sometimes they pick insignificant events.
Okay.
So that's something that I've been working with them on, is like phrasing it as in the story could not continue without this event, because otherwise it's just a small detail and it doesn't need to be like expressed. So
I heard you say that in the lesson multiple times, how you were trying to get that out of them. So I wondered if that maybe was something that they struggled with. What about some of your lower groups? I noticed we don't have quite as much on here. Is that because you're not there yet, or are they struggling to complete that independently?
We're just not there yet. Some of them are struggling to complete. A lot of like that first group that I had, they don't work very well independently, so it's hard to get them to complete things. So that's why it's not as filled out.
Okay. So you said it's hard to get them to complete things independently. Just kind of a follow-up to that. Is it due to lack of motivation, or is it just because they need some scaffolding for the skill?
Lack of motivation. They can do it, they just get distracted very easily when they're working on their own.
Got it. So how might you increase that motivation for them? What strategies might you use to kind of motivate them to get some of that done during their independent literacy experiences?
Sometimes I'll have them work in their group together, because then I feel like sometimes maybe they get overwhelmed, and so then they're like, well, I'm not going to do this. So I do a lot of like group work where you can work with anybody in your guided reading group to complete it. And then like, I don't know, I do a lot of like prizes. If you have this done, you can do this, we can have extra this, just motivating them.
Nice. I like the idea of giving them kind of that partner to work with, because it gives a scaffold, but it also kind of keeps them engaged with it. That's a good idea. So just thinking about the overall guided reading lesson, the two lessons that I observed on Friday, how do you feel that the lessons went?
I thought they went pretty well, actually. They seemed to be engaged in the learning for the most part. They participated in the group. I think they were a little nervous knowing you were in there, because they always like stiffen up when an administrator is in, but they actually did really well.
Good. So what do you feel was the most successful part of your guided reading lesson?
For the high group, I feel like I explained how to pick plot events out well, and they do a really great job at like fluently reading text. Their comprehension isn't always there, but they read really well. Like it's really pretty to listen to.
All right. And then kind of in contrast, what do you feel is the least successful part of your guided reading lesson?
My groups do this really weird thing where they follow along with each other when they read.
When they read independently?
So instead of reading independently at their own speed, they like wait for each other to read certain parts.
Right.
And I think that's really weird, and I feel like maybe they're not getting as much out of it as they could be if they were really reading it. Because I think when they listen to other people read, they don't actively read that section. So it's like something that I've struggled with all year. Like they just default into that. Like, oh, well, I'm going to read this paragraph and I'm going to listen to these people read this part. And it's really weird.
So they're reading silently. So when the student who's reading out loud, they'll try to kind of stay with that student. Is that what you mean? The student that you're listening to? Yeah, so like if I had 3 students sitting here, like, and I had this one read, these 2 would follow along. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't have any idea where that person left off at. So I think sometimes they are reading, and sometimes they're just like spacing off, and then they're like, wait, where are we? What are we doing? That's interesting. So you had students seated, you had 3 students, I think, am I correct? 3 students in at least one of the groups.
Yeah, the first group, they actually were able to read on their own. But my high group defaulted into that like round robin reading.
Got it. So how might you even structure where they're seated and where you're seated during that time to kind of discourage that? Like what might you do with your body, and how might you adjust their bodies or where they're sitting at to kind of, or even the practice of them reading? What might you be able to change or shift that might kind of allow them to focus in on their own text?
I think I can like adjust their volume that they're reading at, because if they're reading quieter, then the other students will have to read on their own. And then like I think if I pick different sections for them to read from, like if I pick different pages, then they would have to read on their own, because I couldn't go like straight to the next student, like the next word.
Those are great ideas. I like both of those ideas. Having them whisper read it to you, but like you said, kind of adjusting, like not picking up right away on that next spot. I like those ideas. So I was collecting some data when, when I was in watching your guided reading lesson, and I know you mentioned a little bit ago that you felt engagement within the guided reading level was high, and it was. For rotation 1 and rotation 2, your engagement for the actual guided reading group was at 100% almost the whole time. There were a couple times when one student kind of might have been looking around, but for the most part, they were all engaged. So I want to talk a little bit about the engagement at the independent literacy experiences. So during rotation 1, the students at independent work were anywhere from 73 to 93% engagement. For rotation 2, 45 to 81%. So there was a little bit of a drop overall in that second rotation. What could you do to increase student engagement during the student independent literacy experiences?
This is hard because we're moving away from rotations, and I feel like they were fairly engaged during rotations, like at the beginning of the year, but then like now that we're moving towards that independent seat work, they're like you said, they're really great during that first rotation, and then they drop off for the rest of the time. And it's hard because I've tried like giving them like small amounts of work or like a lot of tasks, and either way, they still drop off. Like if it's not enough work, then they finish it really quickly, and then they're like doing something else. But if it's too much work, then it's like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to get this done. I'm going to play around instead. So I don't know. I've been experimenting with that a lot this year, and like figuring out what the perfect amount and like what tasks or things I can get them up and moving. And like recently I've been letting them talk at a level 1. And that has improved it a lot.
Good.
Because they've been able to like kind of chat a little bit, but they're also working. So that's been improving the like engagement when they're by themselves, but it's still a struggle.
Good. So thinking about strategies like that, so not necessarily the amount of tasks you give them, but kind of like you said, you allowed them to talk at that level 1. What else might you do maybe as that transition is happening between group 1 and group 2, or as after they've kind of been working for a little bit, what else might you do to kind of refocus them and get them back on track?
I think if because I have like 5 reading groups, so I think if I took like halfway in the group and maybe gave them like a 30-second or to 2-minute like brain break, like a go noodle, or like you can talk to your friends right now about anything you want, or like a structured talk time, I think that might benefit the last half of the reading block, because I think it's just really long.
Right.
Like it's an hour and a half, and sometimes they're sitting for, if they're the first group, then they're sitting for 70 minutes.
Right.
Working all by themselves. So
without that break.
Yeah.
I really like that idea. I think, you know, when we look at research, it says that typically we should have those transitions about every 20 minutes, and you're doing that with your guided reading groups. But I like how you mentioned possibly even giving them a transition within that for your independent workers. And I think a 30-second, 1-minute brain break would be all that it would take. Try that and see how it works.
Yeah.
I think that's a great strategy. So you had them obviously use some observation, and you had them complete this story map. In what other ways could you assess student knowledge of story elements?
Like within the guided reading group?
Yeah.
I do a lot of like who participates.
Okay.
Because if they're not answering, then it's usually that they don't know. So it's a lot of like who participates, who's willing to answer, who I have to like drag an answer out of. And then like just work that they turn in, or questioning a lot too. Like I can ask them a question, and if they have no idea what I'm talking about, then I didn't get it. So.
Right. Got it. All right. So thinking about some of the things that we've talked about, you've come up with some really good ideas to kind of nail down some of those areas that you mentioned that you thought were didn't go as well as you had planned, or maybe even some of that engagement. What are your next steps? What would you like to try next?
Definitely that break in the middle for the independent workers.
Yeah.
And like I don't do it as often as I should, but I always try to give them like a fun task to do, like a drawing or a comic strip or something. So I'm trying to incorporate that too, so it's not just all vocabulary words and reading a story. So
getting some variety in there.
Yeah.
And then as you take those next steps, thinking about adding some brain breaks in for those independent workers, and kind of getting in some of those more engaging tasks and that seem more fun to them but are still learning tasks, what supports do you need as you take those next steps?
I don't know. Actually, I definitely do need to like find some resources for like more not so academically focused tasks, but like that they're still doing academics, but they don't know that they're doing academics.
Right, exactly.
So I feel like I need to do some research on figuring out like what are some good tasks for the rest of this year, and definitely for next year too.
Okay. You might think about looking at some different writing tasks as well, like a raft where they choose a role, an audience, a format, and a topic. So they can do like a letter, or they could do, you know, some different things like that.
Yeah.
Those can be pretty engaging for students. You mentioned also that the idea that you mentioned about having them bring down their volume a little bit so others won't follow along. Is that something that you feel that you might try?
Yeah, definitely.
In that guided reading group? Volume for reading to you is lower?
Yes.
Good. All right, so this document right here has all of the Iowa teaching standards and criteria on it, and you're going to notice that they're pretty similar in verbiage to what we use here in OPS. But what I did is I just went through, and you're not going to see all of them highlighted because I saw just one lesson. And some of them don't apply to a lesson that happens in the classroom. But I went ahead and highlighted all of the areas that I saw happen during the lesson. And then all the unhighlighted areas are things that weren't observed during that particular lesson. And these on the back here, they won't be observed because they're more your professional responsibilities. So then after I took a look at some of those highlights, I pulled out some of those that I thought were some really big strengths that I saw throughout that lesson. So the first one is Standard 1.4 accepts and demonstrates responsibility for creating a classroom culture that it supports the learning of every student. You had to-do list of literacy tasks, you had 2 guided reading groups going, and you really enforced the fact that there were no interruptions to guided reading. Tell me a little bit about how you helped students to understand and kind of train them per se, because there was only one student that interrupted your guided reading group that whole time, and I thought that was just outstanding.
Well, before we even come in, we go to the bathroom, so
Mhm.
that eliminates that, and they know they're not allowed to go when we're doing
Right.
guided reading. And then I don't do this, but I just saw this idea the other day, but I really should have like an ask me person, like somebody who can help them
That's a
when
good
they're
idea.
getting, if they need something,
Mhm.
or if they have a question about a task. But the kids are actually really good about, if like they come in late, they just quietly ask a friend, like, what are
Right.
we doing? But they know that everything's on the board, so
Yeah.
just like a lot of procedure stuff.
Yeah. Well, that really speaks to your preparation of students, the fact that they can come in and do that independently and slide right into that routine. The second one is Standard 2.2, uses knowledge of student development to make learning experiences meaningful and accessible for every student. So you had a leveled text, so the students had been benchmarked and they were at their instructional level. So you pulled a text that was at their instructional level, and then also your text introduction. You introduced a couple of vocab words. Tell me a little bit about how you plan for your text introductions for your students to help kind of scaffold them into that book.
Well, because it's the end of the year, I've been with these kids for a while, so I
Yep.
kind of know the words that they're going to get stuck on, or ones
Right.
that don't grammatically make sense,
Mm-hmm.
that they aren't going to be able to sound out, or maybe ones that they have never had experience with, because some of our kids don't have the same experiences as other children, so they
Yeah.
don't have this like background knowledge for certain
Right.
vocabulary words. So that's usually how I go. I just go through the first couple chapters and pick out words that I think they're going to struggle with.
Okay. So do you do that each time they come back? So if they come back, let's say you read chapter 1 and 2 on one day, and they come back and you're going to start with chapter 3, do you introduce some more words for that chapter?
Yeah.
Excellent. Very nice. Another big strength that I saw was 4.1 aligns classroom instruction with local standards. You were using, and district curriculum, so you're using guided reading, which is our district format for reading. You were using that leveled text at their guided reading instructional level, and you were focused on story elements, which is a Nebraska state standard. Moving down to 6.3, this was another big strength that I noticed. Develops and implements classroom procedures and routines that support high expectations for student learning. And that's kind of what you just spoke to.
Yeah.
Having them understand what those routines are so that they become independent enough that they don't interrupt instruction for other students. So the transition that you had, switching between groups, was only 1 minute. So that was a really quick transition and it went very smooth. I saw you get up multiple times and circulate through the classroom. Even when your students were silent reading, you were up and checking on students to hold them accountable for what they were doing. And then small group engagement checks were about 100%, 7 out of 9 checks that I did. So that was outstanding high engagement within your lesson, meaning that students are getting the content that they need to get to learn. All right, so now there is one area that I wanted to take a look at that was not observed, but I think could be something that would just be that next step to bump up the effectiveness of your guided reading.
Mm-hmm.
So the reason that I selected 5.5, provides substantive, timely, and constructive feedback to students and parents, we're really focusing on that students part, is because descriptive feedback is kind of the heart of guided reading. So descriptive feedback is specific information that tells the learner exactly what they need to do to improve. So when a student was stuck on a word, I heard you give the following feedback. Go back, nope, and look at it. And then when a student figured out a word, I heard you give the following feedback. Good. So thinking about the definition of descriptive feedback, that it's specific and helps the learner know how to improve, would you say that those things qualified as descriptive feedback?
No.
Probably not. So they're praise and motivation, right? Which is super important. You need to do that for your students because they need to know, like, I did something well, right? So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about shifting those and still using that language, the good, and then giving them some more information about what it is they're doing good. So you have one of these in your classroom, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so this is one of my favorite all-time resources. When I was a literacy coach, this was one of my Bibles. It's the Teach, Prompt, and Reinforce Prompting Guide by Fountas and Pinnell. And so Teach, Prompt, and Reinforce are 3 levels of descriptive feedback that we can give to students depending on their level of need. So if a student is unable to do a skill, they don't have the skills to be able to read a word or understand something, we want to teach it. If they're almost there and they just need that nudge, then we want to prompt them. And if they did it well, we want to give them that praise and reinforce it specifically. So what this prompting guide does is really gives you all kinds of intercom, gives you all kinds of different reading actions that students are going to do. So for example, let's look at monitoring and correcting. So if a student is not able to monitor and correct their reading on their own, they don't have the skills at all to do it, you might say something like, that didn't make sense. You need to stop when it doesn't make sense. Or watch me check it. Run your finger left to right under the word and say the word slowly. So it's almost like a mini model, like almost a mini lesson that lasts just a few seconds, and then you're asking that student to do it. For prompting, they just need that nudge. So a lot of times questioning is what we can do to kind of get them there. So why did you stop? What did you notice? Or what's wrong? Were you right? What could you check? 3 of them that are really high yield are, does it look right? Does it sound right? And does it make sense? We want to use the does it make sense one a lot because we want them to attend to meaning. And then for reinforce, when they do something well, maybe that we've spent a lot of time teaching them on, and it's that moment where we're like, yes, they got it. Maybe say something like, you found out what was wrong all by yourself. You found out that tricky part. You checked that with your finger and you knew something was wrong. I also gave just a few more examples that are more specific for students, just from my own experiences. So let's just say a student skips past the captions on the page. You might say, each part of a text is important. The author puts each part there to help us better understand what we are reading. If there are captions on the page, we need to read those too. They give us important information. Go ahead and read the captions. If they just need that nudge, maybe the student misreads a word and gets stuck on it. Does it look right? Does it sound right? Does it make sense? And then that reinforces really bringing the unconscious to the conscious, allowing the students to know what they're doing well. You read that sentence and realized it didn't make sense, so you stopped, went back, reread it trying a new word, and then it made sense. Readers always focus on meaning. Good work. So you're still having that praise that you're using in there. You're just giving them some specific information about what it is that they're doing. Does that sound like something you think maybe you can implement kind of piece by piece?
Definitely.
And the great thing about these is you can, when I was a literacy coach, I would tell my teachers, just have this on your table. Like you can stand it up, you can lay it down. It is okay to have these resources there because planning is not, we can't plan for everything that's going to happen in a lesson. Yeah. All right. So we've talked about a lot of things today. We've talked about a lot of great strengths that we're seeing within the 2 guided reading lessons. We talked about some things that maybe you can move forward on and shift and make some tweaks too. So I'm just going to ask you to summarize a little bit kind of all of our findings. Summarize some things that we talked about were your strengths. Summarize a couple of areas that for improvement to work on. And then implementation tasks. What is it that you're going to try first, and what resources will you use for that? So we'll start with the strengths.
So having engaging kids at the table, they were engaged in the learning the whole time, and having a task list for the kids who were not at my table, I feel like that was a strength. Do you want me to keep?
You can go to the next one if you want. You're
Okay.
fine. Give yourself credit though, because there were a lot more strengths than that, but I know it's hard to remember.
And then for improvement is giving them the engagement of the second round. So definitely need to work on how to engage them the whole time, not just for the first 20 minutes. Descriptive feedback for sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and then so I will definitely use that book because I knew about it, but I didn't really know about it.
Yeah.
So I didn't know that was all in there. So that would be really helpful. And then figuring out brain breaks for them to give them some time, and just I don't know.
Do you have resources for brain breaks?
I have a Go Noodle account. I have vocabulary account, so that's always good.
There's some good yoga ones too that do really quick yoga for students that are nice. It kind of gets their mind centered and kind of gets their body stretched out a little bit. So they have them online. There's some free ones that are really good.
Okay.
But so you have this book. We talked about some resources for some brain breaks. Also, don't forget that Mrs. Stoller is our literacy coach is a great resource for you as well.
Yeah, she helped me last year. She's like the only reason that I know what guided reading is.
Well, you can tell that you've worked on it because
she was amazing last year.
Yep, she is. She's a great resource. So I want to thank you for allowing me to come in and view the lesson and talk with you a little bit about the lesson. And I want to tell you, excellent job for all of the strengths that we saw. And I'm really excited to see some of the next steps implemented in your classroom.
Yeah, me too.
All right.